In the fall of 2023, Luke Hartman, a seasoned hunter, ventured into a privately owned stretch of woodland near Indiana's western border. What unfolded that early morning defied all logic. After confiding in a friend from a nearby reservation, Luke was startled to learn they were already familiar with the eerie happenings in the area and had warned him about the dangers. You won't want to miss this one. In Warren County, Indiana, mid-November means one thing: deer season. Luke had been planning this trip for months, meticulously mapping out the area and tracking deer movements. His confidence soared as he reviewed footage from the trail cameras he'd set up. There was an unusual amount of deer activity which filled him with excitement. 3 days before the hunt, Luke sat at his kitchen table, carefully cleaning his rifle as part of his pre-trip ritual. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. It was his hunting buddy, Daniel, calling to report something strange. While scouting a spot to set up camp, Daniel and the others had discovered peculiar tracks. He explained how these tracks appeared to follow behind an entire herd, as though something had been stalking them. Luke listened intently, but dismissed Daniel's concerns. Despite the ominous description, he insisted there was nothing to worry about. However, Daniel's unease was palpable. He admitted he had a bad feeling about this hunt and suggested changing locations. Luke, stubborn as ever, refused to alter their well-laid plans. Fueled by his determination, and maybe a little too much espresso, he convinced Daniel to stick to the original plan. Over the next few days, Luke threw himself into preparations. He double-checked his equipment, pored over topographical maps, and packed extra supplies, just in case they needed to trek deeper into the woods. Though he knew the area well, he wanted to be as prepared as possible. The night before the hunt, everything was loaded and ready to go. His excitement was so intense he could barely sleep. The alarm blared at 4:30 a.m., signaling the start of the long-anticipated day. Stepping into the crisp, cold air, Luke noticed how his breath hung in the headlights as he checked his truck one last time. The morning was unusually cold, but it only fueled his anticipation. Soon he was off to pick up Daniel and the rest of his hunting crew, ready for whatever awaited them in the shadowy woods. Surprisingly, there was little conversation on the drive, an unusual silence for the group, but they were all hyper-focused on ensuring everything went smoothly, despite Daniel's lingering reservations. Fortunately, they had already scouted the area and chosen their camp spot. When they reached the pull-off, Luke volunteered to go first, eager to start hauling gear to their campsite, which was only about a quarter-mile off the road. About 200 yards into the woods, Luke spotted fresh tracks from what looked like an entire herd of deer. His excitement surged and he scanned the ground carefully. However, he didn't see any of the strange tracks Daniel had described on the phone. He radioed his friends, who were still unloading gear from the truck, to let them know there was a change of plans. Luke told them he was going to follow the tracks and see if the herd was close by. He reassured them it wouldn't take long. His excitement was so overwhelming that he cut his buddies off mid-reply and pressed on, his eyes locked on the ground. To Luke, this felt like his golden opportunity, a meal ticket he couldn't pass up. As he moved deeper into the woods, something struck him as odd. The forest was much quieter than it had been when they scouted the area weeks earlier. Luke paused and listened closely. The usual sounds, squirrels rustling, birds calling, were absent. It was unsettling. Normally, silence like this could mean a predator was nearby, but Luke dismissed the thought. He decided to push another 150 yards into a denser section of the forest. That's when he began to notice something peculiar, a low humming sound. At first he barely registered it, but when he stopped and listened, the sound seemed to come from everywhere at once. He turned his head, trying to pinpoint a direction. To the left? No. Behind him? It didn't make sense. It wasn't mechanical, but it reminded him of a distant transformer, though civilization was miles away. Uneasy but determined, Luke shook it off and continued down the narrow game trail. That's when the smell hit him, a pungent, sickening odor that made him grimace. To his right, lying in the brush, he spotted it, a deer carcass. But something was horribly wrong. The deer hadn't been killed in any natural way. Its body was torn apart, as if it had been ripped limb from limb. The head, cleanly removed, sat bizarrely on a tree stump nearly 30 feet away. Luke's stomach turned. He stepped closer to examine the gruesome scene and realized something else. Hardly any of the deer had been eaten. This wasn't a typical predator's work. Luke's encounter in the woods was something he would never forget. The eerie silence and the unsettling atmosphere made his heart race. As he walked deeper into the forest, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. Every rustle of leaves and snap of twigs sent chills down his spine. He knew he wasn't alone. He quickly decided not to linger. The unsettling quiet and the sight of the mutilated deer were enough to make him second-guess his decision to follow the tracks. He turned back, eager to make good time returning to camp. But only a quarter-mile farther, Luke stumbled upon another carcass. This one too bore the same grotesque injuries, though it appeared older. The smell had faded, but the remains were unmistakable. Whatever had done this wasn't killing to eat, it was killing for sport. A chill ran down Luke's spine as he scanned the woods. For the first time, he began to doubt that these woods were as safe as he had believed. The group's drive into the woods had been unusually quiet, and now Luke found himself alone, following the deer tracks with laser focus. He hadn't seen or heard any animal activity the entire time despite the sun nearly rising. The forest remained eerily silent, save for that strange low humming noise. It would grow louder at times, then fade away like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. After walking away from the second mutilated deer carcass, Luke stopped to check his GPS. That's when he heard movement at his 2 o'clock. It was faint but deliberate. He froze, holding his breath. Whatever it was seemed to stop too, as if it had sensed Luke's presence and was trying to stay hidden. His heart pounded, but his instincts took over. This had to be a large buck nearby, he thought. An opportunity like this was rare, and Luke envisioned himself returning to camp as the hero, the guy who nailed the perfect shot. Crouching low, he crept closer toward a thick stand of trees about 20 feet away. That's when he saw movement, just over a small hill ahead of him. The rising light made it hard to see, but the figure emerging from the hilltop looked off. Luke nearly flinched. He could make out what looked like wolf ears, but this was far larger than any wolf he'd ever seen. His first instinct was to duck behind a nearby tree for cover, but he wasn't fast enough. The figure shifted, and its face came into view. Luke's breath caught in his throat. It was a wolf, but not any ordinary wolf. Everything about it was wrong. It was massive, easily over 7 feet tall. Gray fur covered its body, and its arms, though not quite human, were far longer than a wolf's front legs. Its hands had distinct, elongated fingers tipped with sharp claws. What chilled Luke the most, though, were its eyes. They weren't the eyes of an animal. They were intelligent, deliberate, aware. A dead leaf crunched under Luke's boot, and the creature's head snapped toward him. It took a step forward, fully emerging at the top of the hill. The sheer size and unnatural proportions of it were overwhelming. Luke felt paralyzed. His mind raced. Was this someone in a costume? But no, its movements were far too fluid, too natural. Whatever this thing was, it was alive, real, and sizing him up. Luke's instincts screamed at him to run, but his body refused to move. He knew if he bolted it would chase him, and he wouldn't stand a chance. Then, something unexpected happened. The creature raised one of its clawed hands and began to gesture. Luke squinted in disbelief. The gestures were deliberate, purposeful, and familiar. It took him a moment, but then he realized it was signing. Sign language. Luke knew enough ASL to recognize a few words. The creature signed hello. Nervous, but trying not to provoke it, Luke shakily signed the greeting back. The wolf-like being continued gesturing. Though Luke couldn't understand every sign, he caught 2 words, wolf and heart. What was it trying to say? Was it claiming to be friendly? Was it trying to communicate something deeper? Luke couldn't process what was happening, but the creature soon turned. Without another glance, it strode north, following the same direction as the deer tracks. Luke stood frozen, unable to comprehend the encounter. The stories he had once laughed off, tales of living wolfmen, weren't myths. They were real. After what felt like an eternity, Luke forced himself to move. His legs were shaking as he made his way back to camp. When he arrived, Daniel and the others were busy cleaning gear. They looked up as he approached. "Daniel, any luck?" Luke opened his mouth to respond but stopped himself. How could he even begin to explain what he'd just seen? "Luke, saw some deer but I couldn't get a clean shot." They nodded, but their expressions shifted. Daniel squinted at him, concerned. Daniel, you okay, man? You look like you've seen a ghost. Luke, I'm fine, just not feeling well. Without further explanation, he began packing his gear, muttering that he was heading out early. But his friends convinced him to stay. He spent the rest of the day distracted, unable to shake the encounter. Later, just before sundown, they finally spotted the deer herd, but something was wrong. The deer were spooked, unusually skittish, keeping far out of range. Luke watched them disappear into the darkening woods, knowing deep down that whatever had unsettled the deer was still out there, watching. Max sat by the campfire, still haunted by what he'd seen earlier. After finishing dinner, he finally decided to break his silence. The words tumbled out as he recounted every detail. How he'd seen the creature, its unnatural size and appearance, and most bizarrely, its attempt to communicate through sign language. Max's friends listened in stunned silence. George, always the skeptic, frowned but said nothing. The others, while doubtful, knew Max well enough to realize he wasn't the type to fabricate stories. Eventually they settled into their tents for the night. Hours later, Max jolted awake to a dull, repetitive thud somewhere close to camp. He rushed out of his tent, his heart pounding, only to find the others had heard it too. Before anyone could say a word, the sound stopped, and in its place, silence. But something had been there. George, flashlight in hand, spotted a fresh deer carcass lying at the edge of their camp, just beyond the firelight. The group gathered cautiously around the animal. Its body bore massive teeth marks at the base of its neck, unmistakably canine, but far larger than anything a wolf or coyote could leave behind. George muttered under his breath, shaking his head in disbelief. No one dared voice what they were all thinking. A few days later, Max made the 2-hour drive to visit his old friend Jeremy on the reservation. If anyone could explain what had happened, it was Jeremy. Max described everything in detail. The wolfman, its gestures, and the overwhelming sense of intelligence in its eyes. Jeremy listened, his expression calm, nodding slowly as if none of this surprised him. When Max finished, Jeremy finally spoke. My tribe's encountered it before. It's not just a story, Max. The elders call it the Tall One. He explained how his people had shared the land with these beings for generations. According to tribal history, the wolfmen weren't fully animal nor spirit, but something in between. Beings of the deeper woods that had always existed. Over decades of interactions, the tribe had even attempted to teach one of them sign language. It wasn't perfect, but they had communicated enough to understand fragments of its story. The creature said it traveled north from somewhere far south, Jeremy said. It wouldn't say why, but it mentioned a place near what we believe to be Bow Canyon, Michigan. That area's been known for strange sightings for centuries. Jeremy's voice dropped as he told Max about the historical accounts, warnings passed down through generations, consistent across different tribes like the Potawatomi and the Miami. Stories spoke of creatures called shadow walkers or other hunters that would follow hunting parties, watching silently from the trees. They communicated through gestures just like Max had described, and they were known to leave signs, small offerings of bones, feathers, or killed game, to mark their territory. The elders always warned us not to hunt during certain lunar phases, Jeremy continued. Those nights belong to them, and when outsiders ignore the warnings, bad things happen. Max listened in stunned silence as Jeremy shared an old account from the late 1700s, a story first recorded by French fur traders. One trader, Jean-Baptiste de Bissot, had documented conversations with Miami elders who described encounters with these beings. The elders called them the Tall Ones. The traders were skeptical at first, dismissing the warnings as superstition, but those who ventured too deep into the wrong parts of the forest often returned shaken, or never returned at all. One particularly chilling story came from a hunter decades later, Jeremy said, his voice low. The man had camped in the wilderness for several days. Each night he'd noticed small, strange disturbances around his fire, burnt sticks and ashes scattered about. But his gear remained untouched. Curious, he scouted the area and found massive footprints, barefoot and far larger than any humans. Determined to catch his visitor, the hunter hid in the brush overlooking the campfire one night. Hours passed, and just when he began to doubt himself, a shrill whistle pierced the air. Sharp, unnatural. He turned to face the fire, and there it was. The creature stood in silhouette, massive and unnaturally broad across the shoulders. Its arms hung long at its sides, and though its legs were shorter, its posture was upright, eerily human. But its proportions were wrong. Its head, small compared to its body, seemed to sit directly on its hulking shoulders. For the first time in his life, the hunter was paralyzed with fear. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The thing shifted slightly, turning its head as if studying him, and then without a sound, it melted back into the darkness. The hunter left at dawn and never returned to those mountains again. They're real. Our people have known it for centuries, but most won't talk about it to outsiders. These aren't creatures you hunt, Max. They're beings you respect, and when they want you to know they're there, they make sure you see them. Everything he'd experienced suddenly felt both terrifying and significant. He hadn't imagined it, and he wasn't alone. As he drove home that evening, Max couldn't shake Jeremy's final words. They've always been here, and they're watching. Carl couldn't believe what he was seeing. The earth grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely beneath him. Panic surged through him, but his body remained frozen, unable to move or react. The transparent walls of the craft shimmered faintly, offering an impossible view of the black void beyond. Stars streaked across the expanse in eerie silence. The being, also one it had called itself, watched him calmly, its unreadable face devoid of expression. Carl's thoughts raced. What was happening? Where were they taking him? After what felt like both seconds and hours, the craft suddenly stopped. The immense sensation of motion vanished. Carl felt a faint vibration in the floor beneath him as the being gestured toward another part of the ship. Somehow, Carl's body obeyed the unspoken command, though he never willed himself to move. The room he entered was dimly lit, filled with a soft hum that seemed to reverberate through his bones. At its center was a tall, glowing column of light, pulsing rhythmically. Around it, the other beings, similar to also one, moved methodically, almost robotic in their precision. One approached Carl, placing a strange device near his chest. Immediately, an intense warmth spread through his body, not painful but all-consuming. As the warmth subsided, Carl found that he could suddenly move again. He stumbled backward, gasping for air, his heart pounding. Carl, gasping, "Where am I?" One of the beings responded, not with words but with a voice that echoed directly in his mind. Being, "You are where few have been." Carl's surroundings seemed to shift. The room melted away, replaced by a vision of Earth, his home, spinning silently in the void. Then flashes of strange landscapes appeared, towering metallic structures piercing alien skies, vast deserts of shifting colors, and forests so dark and dense they seemed to swallow light. Being, "You are not alone in the universe. We watch, we visit, and we test." Carl's confusion deepened. Test? Before he could ask more, the beings gestured again, and the room dissolved into a bright, blinding white. When the light faded, Carl found himself standing back in McCarthy Canyon. The forest was silent, untouched, as if nothing had happened. His rifle lay at his feet, and his truck was parked exactly where he'd left it. Shaking, Carl stumbled toward his vehicle, looking around wildly for any trace of the beings or the strange craft. There was nothing. Just the wind through the trees and the distant call of birds. He checked his watch. Only minutes had passed, though it felt like hours, maybe days. Carl's story would go on to baffle locals and investigators for decades. He reported his experience to authorities, friends, and anyone who would listen. Most dismissed him as delusional, but there were others, hunters, hikers, and loggers, who admitted they'd seen strange lights and heard sounds they couldn't explain in the wilderness of Medicine Bow. What happened to Carl Higdon that day remains one of the strangest and most unsettling encounters on record. Whether it was aliens, beings from another dimension, or something humanity has yet to comprehend, one thing is certain. Carl never returned to the woods again. He was convinced of one thing above all else. They're out there. The Wendigo is not just a myth, it is a warning. A warning of what happens when desperation takes hold, when hunger turns humans into something monstrous, something insatiable. Imagine trudging through a remote forest during an endless winter night. Your footsteps echo in the snow, but you begin to hear something else. Another set of steps just slightly behind you. You turn, but nothing's there. The air, sharp with cold, carries a scent that shouldn't exist. Rotting meat. Your pulse quickens. Then you hear it, a voice. Your voice. Or maybe the voice of someone you know. It calls softly from somewhere deep in the woods. Voice, help me. Instinctively you want to run toward it. It sounds so real, but the longer you stand there, the heavier the air becomes. That's when you feel it, the undeniable presence of something watching you. Among the Algonquin-speaking tribes of northern Canada, the Wendigo is said to embody pure hunger. This emaciated creature, 15 feet tall, its gray skeletal skin stretched taut over its frame, is a remnant of humanity destroyed by cannibalism. It is cursed to forever crave flesh no matter how much it devours, and to wander the frozen wilderness hunting for its next victim. But the most terrifying aspect of the Wendigo is not its appearance. It's its power. It doesn't just hunt, it possesses. Travelers say a Wendigo will slowly invade your thoughts, driving you to madness. A man alone in the woods might hear whispers at first, faint voices calling to him, promising warmth, food, safety. Then, as hunger and isolation set in, those whispers become screams. The man will lose himself, becoming another Wendigo. There are tales, ancient ones, of hunters who return to their villages after days in the wilderness, their eyes empty and their movements unnatural. Their families, at first relieved, quickly realized something had followed them home. That smell of decay would seep into the walls of their lodges, and late at night, the voices of their loved ones would twist into screams that echoed through the dark. To this day, in the remote woods of Canada and the northern United States, people still vanish. Locals tell of eerie sightings, skeletal figures taller than any tree gliding silently between the trunks. Snow-covered footprints appear out of nowhere, too large and too strange to belong to any man or animal. And those who venture too far from camp sometimes hear a voice calling to them from the dark. The question is, what would you do if you heard that voice? Would you turn back, or would you step deeper into the forest, into the Wendigo's waiting arms? The Legend of the Wendigo, the story of Jack Fiddler. In the frozen wilderness of northwestern Ontario, tribal beliefs told of a terrifying curse. During times of famine and isolation, some people were pushed to extremes, resorting to cannibalism to survive, but this act was believed to awaken something dark. The Wendigo. The transformation was slow. It began with an insatiable hunger no food could satisfy, followed by violent mood swings and erratic behavior. Eventually, the person would become something else, a monstrous being with an endless craving for human flesh. This chilling legend leads us to our story in 1907. A Royal Canadian Mounted Police officer was trudging through the dense, snow-covered forest, tracking two brothers, Jack Fiddler and his brother Pesequan. The officer had received reports that these men had killed a woman, and they weren't even hiding it. When he reached their remote settlement, Jack, an elderly man in his 70s, was sitting calmly outside his home. When told he was under arrest for murder, Jack didn't resist. He nodded solemnly and explained, "Yes, we killed her. We had to." To understand why Jack so willingly admitted to such a crime, we must go back to the 1830s when he was born into the Oji-Cree tribe of the Sucker clan. Jack's native name, roughly translated to "he who stands in the southern sky," was fitting for someone seen as extraordinary from a young age. Jack had gifts that set him apart. He could communicate with spirits, deflect dark curses, and according to many, even shapeshift. These abilities made him one of the most powerful shamans in the region, but his most critical role was far more terrifying. Jack Fiddler was a Wendigo hunter. For the Algonquin-speaking tribes, the Wendigo wasn't just folklore, it was real. A spirit that could possess people, turning them into bloodthirsty monsters. When someone began showing signs of this possession, erratic behavior, violent urges, the tribe called on Jack to intervene. Over his lifetime, Jack saved his community by performing rituals that ended the lives of 14 people believed to be transforming into Wendigos. In 1907, a family approached Jack with their fears about a woman named Wasakachak. She was acting strangely, violent, unstable, and they believed she was becoming a Wendigo. To Jack and his brother, the answer was clear. They had to act before the spirit fully consumed her. To their community, this wasn't murder. It was mercy. They believed they were saving her soul and protecting everyone from a monster that would surely destroy them all. But times were changing. The Canadian authorities saw things differently. Jack and Pesequan were arrested and taken to jail at Norway House. Jack tried to explain, "You don't understand. I've been hunting these creatures for decades. I've been protecting my people." But his words meant nothing to the officers. To them, this was cold-blooded murder. The case baffled investigators. Jack wasn't behaving like a criminal. He spoke of hunting Wendigos with the same sincerity and duty as a police officer talking about protecting citizens. Even more surprising was the community's response. The people of the settlement stood by Jack, sharing stories of how he had saved them time and time again. They even revealed that one of Jack's 14 Wendigo hunts had been his own brother. Years earlier, Jack's brother had been part of a hunting party stranded in a brutal winter. Desperate and starving, he resorted to cannibalism to survive. When he returned to the tribe, he changed. He became violent, erratic, and would disappear into the forest for days at a time. When he confessed to Jack that he was fighting the urge to kill and eat others, Jack did what he believed was necessary. He ended his brother's life to stop the transformation. But to the law, cultural beliefs didn't matter. Jack and Pesequan were put on trial for murder. The case became a national sensation. Jack, now in jail, realized something far worse than any Wendigo: his people's way of life. Their traditions, their beliefs, were coming to an end. One night, Jack escaped from his cell. He didn't flee. Instead, he walked to a quiet spot nearby, took his ceremonial sash, and hung himself. Pesequan remained in custody. He was found guilty of murder and sentenced to hang. However, fate intervened. As he sat in his cell, he fell gravely ill. Just as a pardon from the Canadian government arrived, acknowledging the complexities of the case, it was too late. Pesequan had already died. The deaths of the Fiddler brothers marked the end of an era. The practice of Wendigo hunting was effectively outlawed, and the Canadian authorities made their stance clear. No matter the belief, killing in the name of spirits or monsters would be treated as murder. Investigators later reflected on the case, struck by the community's sincerity and fear. To the Ojibwe people, the Wendigo wasn't just a legend. It was a dark truth born of starvation, isolation, and survival. Perhaps the Wendigo was a way to explain the unexplainable. What happens when human nature is pushed to its absolute limits? Today, the old stories of Wendigos are still told in the forests of northwestern Ontario, but Wendigo hunters are a thing of the past. Like so many other traditions, they've faded into history. And while we may never uncover the truth behind Jack Fiddler's life and the Wendigo, his story remains a haunting reminder of how folklore and survival can intertwine, and how cultural beliefs can be misunderstood by the world around them. If you've made it this far into the story, comment below Hunting Party to let me know you're here. And if you want more spine-chilling stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Until next time, keep an open mind. Just don't let the Wendigo in.